Hello, and the purpose of this video is to do a critical review of the history of the Samizdat movement in the Soviet Union. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read what Wikipedia has to say, and then I am going to comment critically, all right? So, Samizdat was a form of dissident activity across the Socialist Eastern Bloc in which individuals reproduced censored and underground makeshift publications, often by hand, and passed the documents from reader to reader. The practice of manual reproduction was widespread due to the fact that most typewriters and printing devices required official registration and permission to access. This was a grassroots practice used to evade official Soviet censorship. All right, and they have So let's see. History. Let's look at the history part. Okay. Self-published and self-distributed literature has a long history in Russia. Samizdat is unique to the post-Stalin USSR and other countries with similar systems. Faced with the state's powers of censorship, society turned to underground literature for self-analysis and self-expression. I would argue that the only way that undocumented persons in Sweden could be engaged in political activity that is safe for them is through using the methods of samizdat, adapted to the digital era of social media. For example, you could make videos on YouTube and then make them private and pass them along, right? Or whatever, unlisted or private videos. You don't have to go public with your videos. You can have unlisted and private videos, and then you can pass them along. Sort of like using the tactics of samizdat adapted to the internet, right? That could be something that could be done. I personally can neither confirm nor deny that I do that. Okay, I'm not saying that I engage in that. I'm saying that's an idea of how you could adapt samizdat tactics to 21st century social media, and how it could be useful as a praxis for an undocumented person. Let's say that an undocumented person is because, I mean, the lifestyle of an undocumented person is premised upon survival, right? But I would posit to the undocumented person that in order to give meaning to your survival, you have to resist. And I suggest that you can make that into a praxis. Praxis means the unity of theory and action. So you could make that into a praxis. Hypothetically, this is all hypothetically, I can neither confirm nor deny that I am engaged in that type of activity. I'm simply talking. You could engage in that sort of activity as in terms of a praxis, and perhaps you can develop a type of samizdat using WhatsApp or Signal or YouTube, in order to create in order to organize an undocumented person's underground that is safe from surveillance of the Swedish state. For example, this is all hypothetical. Let's see. Right. Self-published. I already read this. Self-published and self-distributed literature has a long history in Russia. Samizdat is unique to the post-Stalin USSR and other countries with similar systems. Faced with the state's powers of censorship, society turned to underground literature for self-analysis and expression. By the way, in Cuba, that exists. In Cuba, there is a samizdat. In Cuba, there is obviously a samizdat. If you look at the protests that happened in July of 2021, it was precisely to samizdat methods that those protests were prepared and erupted. And I mean, there is also by no means is the Cuban internal opposition right wing or capitalist restorationist or whatever. There is also a left opposition, which used to be represented for years by Corriente Socialista Democrática, but Corriente Socialista Democrática split into two factions, and now there's a social democratic faction that wants to capitalist restoration, and then there is the nominally left opposition faction, which allegedly has been taken over by the government or penetrated by the government. So unfortunately, the left opposition in Cuba is no longer tenable. But they used to use samizdat methods too. And I mean, at one point, Corriente Socialista Democrática included Social Democrats, Trotskyists, anarchists. So, let's see. The first full-length book to be distributed as samizdat was Boris Pasternak's 1957 novel Dr. Zhivago. And that's a great movie. I watched it. It's a really good movie, especially the ending when the little kid, the mom gives the little kid like the journal, and the little kid keeps walking, but the secret police takes the mom, and then she looks out of the car window, and the little kid is walking by himself, carrying the notebook, and she's headed towards the NKVD dungeon, but the kid is free. Or it's an interesting story. It's a very nice story, Dr. Zhivago. Anyways, although the literary magazine Novi Mir had published 10 poems from the book in 1954, a year later the full text was judged unsuitable for publication and entered samizdat circulation. Certain works, though published legally by the state-controlled media, were practically impossible to find in bookshops and libraries and found their way into samizdat. For example, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novel One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich was widely distributed via samizdat. At the outset of the Khrushchev thaw in the mid-1950s, USSR poetry became very popular. Writings of a wide variety of poets circulated among Soviet intelligentsia, non-prohibited repressed writers, as well as those young and unknown. A number of samizdat publications carried unofficial poetry, among them the Moscow magazine Syntaxis, published between 1959 and 1960, by writer Alexander Ginsburg, Vladimir Osipov's Boomerang 1960, and Phoenix 1961, produced by Yuri Galanskov and Alexander Ginsburg. Please forgive the fact that I am Hispanic, Latin American. My pronunciation of Russian names is very poor. So if you're a Russian person watching this, please forgive that. Anyways, let's see what else it says. Okay. The 1965 show trial of writers Julie Daniel and Andrei Siniabsky, charged with anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, and the subsequent increased repression marked the demise of the thaw and the beginning of harsher times for samizdat authors. Yeah. The trial was carefully documented in the samizdat collection called The White Book, 1966, compiled by Yuri Galanskov and Alexander Ginsburg. Both writers were among those later arrested and sentenced to prison in what was known as the Trial of the Four. And this reminds me, that in the novel, George Orwell's novel 1984, where it says that thought crime is the crime that contains all others in itself. Thought crime, the inevitable consequence of thought crime is death, right? And of that, in making these videos in which I'm critical of the Swedish state, but whatever. In the following years, some samizdat content became more politicized and played an important role in the dissident movement in the Soviet Union, right? Let's see. Notable samizdat periodicals. I've heard about this. Chronicle of Current Events, the Anti-Pravda. Oh, actually, the True Pravda. Right. A Chronicle of Current Events was one of the longest-running samizdat periodicals in the post-Stalin USSR. This unofficial newsletter reported violations of civil rights and judicial procedure by the Soviet government and responses to those violations by citizens across the Soviet Union. Appearing first in April 1968, it soon became the main voice of the Soviet human rights movement inside the country and abroad. Okay, see here. Soviet human rights movement. What is that? In the 1980s, a human rights movement began to emerge in the USSR. Those actively involved did not share a single seat. Those actively involved did not share a single set of beliefs. Many wanted a variety of civil rights, freedom of expression, of religious belief, of national self-determination. To some, it was crucial to provide a truthful record of what was happening in the country, not the heavily censored version provided in the official media outlets, such as Pravda, right, or Izvestia. What was the saying? There is no truth in Pravda and there is no news in Izvestia, right? Others still were reform communists who thought it possible to change the Soviet system for the better. Yeah, I guess the reform communists would be, reform communist was the code word for Trotskyist and dissident Marxists in the 80s, right? You couldn't use the word Trotskyist. Association with the word Trotskyist in the Soviet Union was deadly. So they had to come up with another name. So Reform Communists was one of the ones. Not all Reform Communists were Trotskyists, but many Reform Communists were informed by the politics of Trotskyists and probably kept like clandestine copies of The Revolution Betrayed or whatever around. But yeah. Anyways, yeah. Yeah, let's see. So I want to read something here. Not something else here. Right. Self-publishing. Yeah. Let's see. I want to see something here. Yeah. This is of course Alexander Solzhenitsyn, right? The guy who wrote Gulag Archipelago. Him. And I've read his book. That Gulag Archipelago book is really, really good. From 1973. The Gulag Archipelago. I recommend that book. Please read it. Actually, please read The Revolution Betrayed by Leon Trotsky, and then read The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, an experiment in literary investigation. Okay. The Gulag Archipelago, an experiment in literary investigation, is a 3-volume nonfiction text written between 1958 and 1968 by Russian writer and Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It was first published in 1973 and translated into English and French the following year. Excuse me. It covers life in what is often known as the Gulag, the Soviet forced labor camp system, through a narrative constructed from various sources, including reports, interviews, statements, diaries, legal documents, and Solzhenitsyn's own experience as a Gulag prisoner, right? And yeah, I mean, the archipelago of detention centers operated by the Swedish Migration Board in Sweden, where they throw in paperless, undocumented, stateless, refused asylum seekers, etc., is not a forced labor camp. Okay, it's not as bad as a forced labor camp, but it is a form of arbitrary detention that violates the human rights of the people who are interned there. Okay, that's my perspective. This is the book. Actually, I have this book. I have the PDF. I have the PDF and the EPUB. And yeah. See, back to Samizdat. What else can I say about Samizdat? It's a big article, and I'm gonna put the yeah. Oh, let's see this. Anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. What does that Article 70 of the? Let's see. Anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda was Article 70 of the Russian Socialist Federated Socialist Republic Penal Code, right? Anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda was a criminal offense in the Soviet Union. To begin with, the term was interchangeably used with counter-revolutionary agitation. The latter term was in use immediately after the first Russian Revolution in February 1917. The offense was codified in criminal law in the 1920s and revised in the 1950s into articles of the Russian Socialist Federated Socialist Republic Criminal Code. The offense was widely used against Soviet dissidents. Yeah, but I want to make a difference here, though. And yeah, I'm probably biased here. This is a biased comment because I am informed about the politics of Trotskyism. You know, in the first part of the Russian Revolution, when there was the Russian Civil War, the Soviet government, the revolutionary government, the Soviet government had to take measures because there were white agents, you know, trying to destroy the revolution and restore the Tsar, you know. So in that context, they had to defend the revolution. However, when Stalin took over that system and turned it into a tool of repression against the working class, right? Because according to Trotskyism, what happened was that the bureaucracy led by Stalin usurped power from the working class and marginalized the working class and subjected the working class to a regime of police terror. So, yeah. So I would say that there are, you know, yeah. I mean, in the Wikipedia article, you know, that they try to conflate, you know, I don't know. I'm not sure if you can really. I understand that the term was interchangeably used with counter-revolutionary agitation. You know, counter-revolutionary agitation meant one thing in the in context of February 1917, counter-revolutionary agitation meant one thing, but in context of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda meant something else. Okay, I would argue that, but I'm sure that other people would say no, it's not. Whatever. Okay, yeah, whatever. But yeah, I don't know. At least I've just explained in a sort of crude version of the Trotskyist perspective. Dissident movement in the Soviet Union. Soviet dissidents were people who disagreed with certain features of Soviet ideology or with its entirely Soviet dissidents were people who disagreed with certain features of Soviet ideology or with its entirety and who were willing to speak out against them. The term dissident was used in the Soviet Union in the period from the mid-60s until the fall of communism. It was used to refer to small groups of marginalized intellectuals whose challenges, from modest to radical, to the Soviet regime met protection and encouragement from correspondence and typically criminal prosecution or other forms of silencing by the authorities. Following the etymology of the term, a dissident is considered to sit apart from the regime. As dissenters began self-identifying as dissidents, the term came to refer to an individual whose nonconformism was perceived to be for the good of a society. The most influential subset of the dissidents, known as the Soviet Human Rights the most influential subset of the dissidents is known as the Soviet Human Rights Movement. And I already read about the Soviet Human Rights Movement, right? And I remember, reading somewhere about this in the 1970s, when the Soviet Human Rights Movement, they actually dared to stage demonstrations in Moscow and Leningrad. And I mean, the KGB would come out and grab their signs. They would grab their signs and round them up, right? And all they were demanding was of the Soviet government was enforce the Soviet Constitution of 1976, right? And enforce the Soviet Constitution. Very simple, because the Soviet Constitution said that it guaranteed human rights and whatever. So enforce the Soviet Constitution, guarantee the human rights, but that Constitution was window dressing. It was a piece of paper, But yeah, the KGB would grab the signs and stuff, round them up, and then many of them ended up in a psychiatric hospital because the KGB would say that, they must be crazy in order to not see the wonders of the existing socialism or whatever. That they must be crazy to criticize existing socialism for not respecting human rights. So they would throw them in a psychiatric hospital, whatever. Let's see about, just to look at the facts, Soviet psychiatry. Yeah, here we have another Wikipedia article. Political abuse of psychiatry in the Soviet Union. There was systematic political abuse of psychiatry in the Soviet Union based on the interpretation of political opposition or dissident as a psychiatric problem, based on the interpretation of political opposition or dissent as a psychiatric problem. It was called psychopathological mechanisms of dissent. And here in Sweden, this problem exists because I've experienced it. I've been called paranoid. I've been called, somebody once told me if I hadn't taken my paranoia medication, whatever, in Sweden they use this tactic too, of trying to brand people who criticize as paranoid, psychiatrically disturbed, whatever, They don't quite use the term psychopathological mechanisms, but the Swedish authorities have their own thing.